It's strange how some memories linger in your mind like a shadow that never quite leaves. For me, the events of that trip have become one of those shadows, an unsettling fragment of my past that I rarely allow myself to revisit. At the time, I was just an ordinary man, juggling work and family life, trying to find balance in a world that often seemed too chaotic. My wife, Rachel, and I had 2 kids, Emma, 7, and Lucas, 4. They were my world, the reason I worked late nights and endured early mornings. We lived in the city, caught up in its relentless pace, so when a colleague suggested a quiet little town in the countryside for a much-needed getaway, I jumped at the idea. It sounded perfect, a week to unwind, to spend quality time with my family, and to escape the pressures of everyday life. The drive to the town was long, and by the time we left the last stretch of highway and turned onto the narrow, unlit road that led to our destination, the kids were already asleep in the back seat. The only sounds in the car were the soft hum of the engine and the occasional sigh from Rachel, who was dozing off beside me. I was exhausted, but I wanted to push through and get there. It was then that I saw the first figure. Standing on the shoulder of the road, illuminated briefly by the car's headlights, was a man. He wore simple clothes, dark pants and a button-up shirt, but something about him felt off. He was completely still, almost statue-like, and his face was turned away. I gripped the wheel a little tighter but didn't slow down. Probably just a hitchhiker, I told myself, though something about the way he stood there sent a shiver down my spine. Not 5 minutes later, I saw another figure, a woman this time, standing in much the same way, her arms hanging limply at her sides. She was farther from the road, almost hidden by the trees, but I caught a glimpse of her face as we passed. Pale, emotionless, watching. By the third figure, a young boy standing barefoot near a bend in the road, I felt my heart racing. This time, I caught myself glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the boy running after us. But there was nothing. Rachel stirred beside me. "Everything okay?" she mumbled, her voice heavy with sleep. "Yeah, just tired," I replied quickly, not wanting to wake her or the kids. I didn't mention what I had seen. It was late, and my rational mind clung to the idea that I was just imagining things, that the darkness and fatigue were playing tricks on me. The road seemed to stretch on forever, winding through dense patches of forest that loomed like walls on either side. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, and I found myself leaning forward, trying to peer into the blackness ahead. Every so often, I thought I saw movement among the trees, just a flicker, a shadow, but I kept my focus on the road. Finally, after what felt like hours, the lights of the town appeared in the distance. Relief washed over me, though it was short-lived. As we entered the town, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that those figures I had seen on the road were somehow still with us. I parked the car outside a small inn, the only building with its lights still on. The kids stirred awake as I cut the engine, and Rachel yawned, stretching in her seat. "We're here," I said, though the words felt hollow. Little did I know, the shadows of that road were only the beginning. The town was eerily quiet as we stepped out of the car. A cool breeze whispered through the narrow streets, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and something metallic, like rust. The inn stood at the corner of a small square, its facade worn and weathered by time. The dim, flickering light of a single bulb above the entrance barely illuminated the peeling paint on the walls. Rachel carried Lucas, still half asleep, while Emma held my hand, yawning as we approached the front door. I knocked, and the sound echoed unnaturally in the silence. For a moment, I wondered if anyone was even awake to answer. Then the door creaked open, revealing an older man with a weathered face and tired eyes. "You must be the family that called earlier," he said, his voice gruff but polite. "Come in, come in." The inn's interior was small but clean, furnished with old wooden chairs and a desk that seemed to belong to another era. A clock ticked loudly on the wall, its hands frozen at 11:30, as if the time had no meaning here. The man introduced himself as Mr. Grant and handed me a heavy brass key. "Room at the end of the hall," he said, gesturing vaguely toward a dimly lit corridor. "Breakfast at 7. Rachel gave me a look that said, "Let's just get some sleep," and I nodded. We headed down the hall, our footsteps muffled by the faded rug beneath us. The room was simple: 2 beds, a small table with a lamp, and a window that overlooked the empty square outside. "Not bad," Rachel murmured as she laid Lucas on one of the beds and covered him with a blanket. Emma climbed into the other bed, already drifting back to sleep. I stood by the window, staring out into the square. The streetlights flickered occasionally, casting long, distorted shadows. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement near the edge of the square, a figure stepping into the shadows, but when I blinked, it was gone. "You coming to bed?" Rachel's voice broke the silence, pulling me from my thoughts. "Yeah, just a minute," I said, though I lingered at the window for another moment. Something about the town felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the sense of unease that had followed me on the road hadn't left. When I finally lay down, exhaustion pulled me into a restless sleep. But the night was far from over. I woke suddenly to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was one of the kids, but as I sat up and listened, I realized the sound was coming from outside. Steady, deliberate steps echoed faintly in the square, growing louder and then fading, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I got out of bed and moved quietly to the window, careful not to wake Rachel or the kids. The square was empty, but the sound persisted, coming from somewhere just out of sight. My chest tightened as I strained my eyes, searching the shadows. Then I saw it. A silhouette emerged briefly from the darkness, moving slowly along the edge of the square. It was tall, with broad shoulders and an unnatural stillness to its movements. It stopped for a moment, turning its head toward the inn, and I froze. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze, cold and penetrating, like it knew I was watching. I stepped back from the window, my pulse racing. The footsteps started again, fading into the distance. For the rest of the night, I stayed awake, sitting by the window, my eyes fixed on the square below. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. Morning couldn't come soon enough. Morning arrived with an overcast sky that painted everything in muted shades of gray. The town, now illuminated by the weak light of day, didn't look much better than it had the night before. The square was still empty, the buildings around it old and crumbling, as though time had passed through but forgotten to take them along. Rachel was in better spirits, though, and so were the kids. "This is quaint," she said, looking around as we stepped outside the inn. "I bet it's even nicer when the sun's out." "Maybe," I said, though I couldn't shake the lingering unease. We decided to explore the town, hoping to find a cafe or somewhere to grab breakfast. The streets were narrow, winding through clusters of small houses with peeling paint and sagging roofs. As we walked, I noticed something odd. The town seemed alive but muted. People moved about, but there was little chatter, no laughter, none of the usual sounds of a bustling community. The locals, too, felt strange. Their clothes were outdated, simple dresses, slacks, and button-up shirts that looked like they belonged to another era. And they all had the same expression, a hollow, distant look, as if their minds were elsewhere. One woman stood in the doorway of a shop, her arms crossed as she stared at us. I nodded politely, but she didn't respond, her gaze fixed on me until we turned the corner. "What's wrong with these people?" Rachel whispered. "I don't know," I admitted. "But let's just find something to eat." We eventually stumbled upon a small diner at the edge of town. The sign above the door was faded, its letters barely legible, but the smell of coffee and fresh bread was inviting. Inside, the diner was almost empty except for an older couple sitting in the corner, their heads bent close as they whispered to each other. The waitress approached us with a forced smile. "What'll it be?" she asked, her voice flat. We ordered quickly, and I couldn't help but notice her hands trembling slightly as she wrote down our choices. When she walked away, Rachel leaned in. "I don't like this place," she said quietly. "It feels wrong." She wasn't wrong. There was something oppressive about the atmosphere, like the air was heavier here. I felt it too, a pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe. The food was decent, but the silence in the diner was suffocating. The couple in the corner left without a word, and I noticed they avoided looking in our direction. When the waitress brought the check, I caught her glancing nervously toward the window. "Is everything okay?" I asked. She hesitated, her eyes darting to Rachel and then back to me. "If I were you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I wouldn't stay out after dark." Before I could ask her to elaborate, she walked away, disappearing into the kitchen. Back outside, the streets seemed emptier than before. Even the few locals we had seen earlier were gone, and the wind had picked up, whistling through the narrow alleys. The kids wanted to play in the square, but I couldn't bear to stay there any longer. "Let's go back to the inn," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Rachel gave me a questioning look but didn't argue. As we walked, I glanced over my shoulder more than once, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. The quiet was unbearable, broken only by the occasional creak of a shutter or the rustle of leaves in the wind. By the time we reached the inn, my nerves were frayed. I tried to push the thoughts aside, to convince myself that I was overreacting, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, as the kids slept and Rachel read a book by the dim light of the lamp, I found myself staring out the window again. The square was as empty as ever, but the shadows seemed darker, deeper, as if they were hiding something just out of sight. I told myself it was nothing, just a small, quiet town. But I couldn't stop the nagging thought that we didn't belong here, and that someone or something didn't want us to stay. Morning arrived with an overcast sky that painted everything in muted shades of gray. The town, now illuminated by the weak light of day, didn't look much better than it had the night before. The square was still empty, the buildings around it old and crumbling, as though time had passed through but forgotten to take them along. Rachel was in better spirits, though, and so were the kids. "This is quaint," she said, looking around as we stepped outside the inn. "I bet it's even nicer when the sun's out." "Maybe," I said, though I couldn't shake the lingering unease. We decided to explore the town, hoping to find a cafe or somewhere to grab breakfast. The streets were narrow, winding through clusters of small houses with peeling paint and sagging roofs. As we walked, I noticed something odd. The town seemed alive but muted. People moved about, but there was little chatter, no laughter, none of the usual sounds of a bustling community. The locals, too, felt strange. Their clothes were outdated, simple dresses, slacks, and button-up shirts that looked like they belonged to another era. And they all had the same expression, a hollow, distant look, as if their minds were elsewhere. One woman stood in the doorway of a shop, her arms crossed as she stared at us. I nodded politely, but she didn't respond, her gaze fixed on me until we turned the corner. "What's wrong with these people?" Rachel whispered. "I don't know," I admitted, "but let's just find something to eat." We eventually stumbled upon a small diner at the edge of town. The sign above the door was faded, its letters barely legible, but the smell of coffee and fresh bread was inviting. Inside, the diner was almost empty except for an older couple sitting in the corner, their heads bent close as they whispered to each other. The waitress approached us with a forced smile. "What'll it be?" she asked, her voice flat. We ordered quickly, and I couldn't help but notice her hands trembling slightly as she wrote down our choices. When she walked away, Rachel leaned in. "I don't like this place," she said quietly. "It feels wrong." She wasn't wrong. There was something oppressive about the atmosphere, like the air was heavier here. I felt it too, a pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe. The food was decent, but the silence in the diner was suffocating. The couple in the corner left without a word, and I noticed they avoided looking in our direction. When the waitress brought the check, I caught her glancing nervously toward the window. "Is everything okay?" I asked. She hesitated, her eyes darting to Rachel and then back to me. "If I were you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I wouldn't stay out after dark." Before I could ask her to elaborate, she walked away, disappearing into the kitchen. Back outside, the street seemed emptier than before. Even the few locals we had seen earlier were gone, and the wind had picked up, whistling through the narrow alleys. The kids wanted to play in the square, but I couldn't bear to stay there any longer. "Let's go back to the inn," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Rachel gave me a questioning look but didn't argue. As we walked, I glanced over my shoulder more than once, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. The quiet was unbearable, broken only by the occasional creak of a shutter or the rustle of leaves in the wind. By the time we reached the inn, my nerves were frayed. I tried to push the thoughts aside, to convince myself that I was overreacting, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, as the kids slept and Rachel read a book by the dim light of the lamp, I found myself staring out the window again. The square was as empty as ever, but the shadows seemed darker, deeper, as if they were hiding something just out of sight. I told myself it was nothing, just a small, quiet town. But I couldn't stop the nagging thought that we didn't belong here, and that someone or something didn't want us to stay. The following day, Rachel suggested taking the kids to explore the outskirts of the town. She thought it might lift the strange mood that had settled over us. I agreed, hoping the fresh air and change of scenery would help clear my head. We followed a dirt path that led out of the town and into a dense forest. The trees were ancient, their gnarled branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. The kids ran ahead, laughing as they tried to climb the low branches, and for a brief moment I felt a sense of relief. But as we ventured deeper, that familiar unease crept back. The forest was too quiet. There were no bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just an oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of our footsteps on the gravel path. "Stay close, okay?" I called out to the kids, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. The path eventually opened into a small clearing. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable, just a circle of tall grass surrounded by trees, but then I noticed the stones. They were arranged in a crude ring at the center of the clearing, each one covered in strange symbols that looked like they had been carved with a blade. Some of the carvings were deep and jagged, as though whoever had made them had been in a frenzy. "What is this?" Rachel asked, her voice hushed. "I don't know," I replied, stepping closer. The air felt colder here, as if the clearing itself rejected the warmth of the sun. Emma and Lucas, oblivious to our discomfort, started playing near the stones. "Careful," Rachel said sharply, pulling them back. As I studied the symbols, a faint sound reached my ears, a low murmur, almost like a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the trees. I turned quickly, scanning the shadows, but there was no one there. The murmur became clearer, like voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. My skin prickled, and my heart began to race. "We should go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Rachel nodded, sensing my unease. We gathered the kids and started back down the path, but the whispers followed us, growing fainter and then louder again, as if whatever was making them was moving through the trees. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind playing tricks on my mind, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to see someone, or something, emerging from the shadows. When we finally reached the edge of the forest and the town came back into view, the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of our hurried footsteps on the dirt path. That night, I couldn't sleep. Rachel seemed calmer, brushing off the events of the day as nothing more than an odd coincidence. But I couldn't shake the memory of those symbols or the whispers in the forest. As I sat by the window, watching the darkened square below, I heard something else. Not whispers this time, but footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, circling the inn. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned closer to the glass, trying to peer into the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure moving along the edge of the square, but it vanished before I could make out any details. I stayed there for hours, my heart pounding, until the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. Whatever was happening in this town, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The third night was when everything truly unraveled. That day had passed in a haze of unease. Rachel and the kids had spent most of it indoors, playing games and reading, while I pretended to busy myself with errands around the inn. In reality, I was restless, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching us. As the sun set and the town sank back into its eerie silence, I told Rachel I needed some air. She gave me a worried look but didn't argue. I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin, and found myself drawn back to the edge of the forest. I couldn't explain why I went. Maybe it was the whispers from the day before, or the memory of those strange symbols. Part of me wanted to understand what was happening, to convince myself that there was a logical explanation for it all. The forest was darker than ever, the moonlight barely penetrating the thick canopy above. As I followed the path, the stillness became oppressive, and I began to question my decision to come here alone. Then I heard it. A low, rhythmic chanting echoed through the trees, faint at first but growing louder as I moved deeper into the forest. The sound sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't like the whispers from before. This was deliberate, organized, like a group of voices reciting something in unison. I crept closer, the chanting leading me to the same clearing we had found earlier. This time, it wasn't empty. A circle of figures stood around the stones, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. Each of them held a torch, the flickering flames casting long, distorted shadows. In the center of the circle, a man knelt on the ground, his head bowed. The chanting rose and fell like a wave, the words incomprehensible but filled with an unsettling intensity. I crouched behind a tree, my breath shallow as I watched. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning wood and something else, something metallic, like blood. One of the figures stepped forward, raising their torch high. The chanting stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. The figure spoke, their voice low and gravelly. I couldn't make out the words, but their tone was commanding, almost reverent. Then, without warning, They pulled a knife from their robes and raised it above the kneeling man. My heart leaped into my throat. I stepped back instinctively, and the crunch of leaves beneath my feet sounded impossibly loud. The figure froze, their heads snapping in my direction. For a moment, there was complete stillness. Then the others turned, one by one, their hoods tilting toward where I hid. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind me. Branches scratched at my face and arms as I pushed forward, my legs burning with the effort. The chanting resumed, louder now, mixed with the sound of footsteps closing in. I burst out of the forest and into the town, gasping for breath. The streets were empty, but I didn't stop. I ran straight to the inn, slamming the door behind me and locking it. Rachel appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale with worry. "What's wrong?" she asked. "We're leaving," I said, my voice shaking. "Pack the bags. We're leaving right now." Rachel didn't argue. Maybe it was the urgency in my voice or the wild look in my eyes, but she simply nodded and hurried to wake the kids. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the bags, stuffing clothes and belongings in without care. All I could think about was getting out, away from the forest, away from the town, and away from whatever those people were doing. Emma and Lucas were groggy and confused, rubbing their eyes as Rachel helped them get their shoes on. "Daddy, what's happening?" Emma asked, her small voice laced with fear. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," I said, trying to sound calm. "We just need to leave early, that's all." But my tone betrayed me. Rachel caught my eye, her expression filled with unspoken questions. I couldn't explain. Not yet. With the bags loaded into the car, we piled in, and I started the engine. The sound of it roaring to life felt deafening in the stillness of the town. I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw nothing but empty streets. Yet the weight of unseen eyes pressed down on me, as if the town itself were watching us leave. I drove faster than I should have, the car bumping over the uneven road as we headed out of town. The kids sat quietly in the back, sensing the tension. Rachel kept looking over her shoulder, her unease mirroring my own. As we neared the edge of the town, the headlights caught something that made my stomach drop, a figure standing at the side of the road, just like the ones I'd seen on our way in. This time, it was a woman, her face partially obscured by her long hair. She didn't move as we passed, but her head turned slowly to follow the car. Rachel gasped. "Did you see that?" "Yes," I muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. "Don't look back." The road stretched out before us, winding through the dense forest. I pushed the car as fast as it could go, desperate to put distance between us and the town. But just as I began to think we were safe, the headlights caught another figure, then another. They stood at intervals along the roadside, their faces pale and blank, their eyes fixed on us. The air in the car grew thick with tension. Rachel held Lucas close, and Emma clutched her stuffed animal tightly, her wide eyes darting from the window to me. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw them. A procession of figures, walking slowly down the center of the road behind us. Their torches burned brightly, their light flickering like an otherworldly fire. "They're following us," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. I pressed the accelerator harder, the engine straining as we sped through the dark forest. My hands were slick with sweat, and my heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Finally, the forest began to thin, and the road opened onto the highway. The figures disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared, swallowed by the darkness behind us. For the first time in hours, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Rachel reached for my hand, her grip firm but trembling. "We're okay," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The rest of the drive was silent. The kids fell asleep again, and Rachel leaned against the window, her expression unreadable. I kept my eyes on the road, but the images from the town played over and over in my mind. The hooded figures, the torches, the whispers in the forest. We didn't stop until we reached the city. When I finally parked in front of our house, the sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands still gripping the wheel. Rachel broke the silence. "What happened back there?" I stared ahead, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know," I said finally. "And I don't want to know. It's been years since that night, and I've never gone back to that town. I don't think I ever will." For a long time, I tried to bury what happened, to convince myself that it was all in my head, a product of exhaustion and an overactive imagination. But no matter how hard I tried, the memories refused to fade. The whispers, the chanting, the pale, expressionless faces, they haunt me still, creeping into my dreams and turning them into nightmares. Rachel doesn't ask about it anymore, though I know she hasn't forgotten. She never brought it up after that night, as if speaking about it might give it power. The kids, thankfully, were too young to remember much. To them, it was just a strange road trip where we came home early. But for me, it's a scar. Not a visible one, but something deeper, carved into my mind like the symbols on those stones. I think about that forest more often than I'd like to admit. Sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers, not real ones, but echoes of the ones I heard there, replaying in my head. I still wonder what was happening in that clearing. Who were those people? What were they doing, and why? The logical part of me tries to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a group of eccentric locals performing some kind of bizarre tradition. But deep down, I know it was more than that. The fear I felt that night wasn't normal. It was primal, an instinctive reaction to something I couldn't understand. Once, out of morbid curiosity, I tried to look up the town online. I wanted to know if anyone else had experienced something similar, if there were stories or rumors that might explain what I saw. But the search turned up nothing. It was as if the town didn't exist. And maybe that's for the best. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that some questions are better left unanswered. Whatever I stumbled upon in that forest, whatever those people were trying to summon or contain, it wasn't meant for me to understand. All I know is that I got my family out, and that's enough. Sometimes, though, late at night when the world is quiet, I find myself thinking about the road that led us there. I remember the figures standing by the side of the road, their blank faces illuminated by the headlights. I wonder if they're still there, waiting for someone else to come along. It happened a few years ago, but the memory still lingers like a shadow I can't quite shake. At the time, I was working a demanding job that often took me on long trips, usually to places far less glamorous than anyone would imagine. That particular night, I was driving back from a small-town conference, eager to get home after 2 exhausting days. The road stretched endlessly before me, shrouded in darkness. My headlights illuminated the rain-slicked pavement, and the occasional rustling of trees on either side of the road only emphasized how isolated I was. It had been hours since I'd seen another car or passed any signs of civilization. I glanced at the dashboard clock, almost 10 p.m. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since lunch. I was too tired to keep going without food, and as much as I wanted to get home, I knew I needed a break. That's when I saw it, a small neon sign flickering faintly in the distance. The word diner was barely legible, with some of the letters sputtering on and off. It wasn't much, but it was the first sign of life I'd seen in miles. The building was small and old, its facade faded and worn. A single street lamp cast a dim glow over the gravel parking lot, and the only sound was the steady patter of rain against the car windows. For a moment, I hesitated. Something about the place felt off. But my hunger and exhaustion won out. I pulled into the lot, turned off the engine, and stepped out. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of wet earth. The neon sign buzzed faintly overhead as I made my way to the door. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and I was immediately struck by how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that makes you question if you've walked into the wrong place. "Hello," I called out, but my voice felt small in the stillness. Behind the counter stood a man, likely in his late 40s, with slicked-back hair and a too-perfect uniform. His eyes met mine briefly before he nodded in acknowledgement. "Sit anywhere," he said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. I chose a booth near the window, though there wasn't much to see outside except the faint reflection of the neon sign against the rain. The interior of the diner was as worn as its exterior. Cracked vinyl seats, faded wallpaper, and tables that bore the marks of countless years of wear. I opened the menu, but the choices were sparse: burgers, sandwiches, and the kind of greasy fare you'd expect from a roadside diner. Before I could decide, the man appeared at my table, his expression as blank as before. "Coffee?" he asked. "Yes, please," I replied. "And I'll take a grilled cheese sandwich." He nodded, scribbling the order down before walking away. As I waited, I took in more of the diner's details. The longer I looked, the more unsettling it felt. There were marks on the walls, scratches, almost, but arranged in patterns. I leaned closer to get a better look. They weren't random. They looked deliberate, like symbols carved with precision. A sudden noise startled me, and I turned to see the man returning with my coffee. He set the cup down without a word, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than I was comfortable with before he walked away again. I tried to focus on the coffee, but my eyes kept wandering back to the symbols. They were faint, blending into the faded wallpaper, but now that I'd seen them, I couldn't unsee them. When my sandwich arrived, I tried to brush off the feeling of unease. I was just tired, I told myself. The strange carvings, the eerie silence, they were just quirks of an old diner in the middle of nowhere. But as I took my first bite, I couldn't shake the sensation that something about this place was very wrong. The sandwich tasted off. Not bad exactly, but something about it made me lose my appetite. Maybe it was the atmosphere, or maybe it was the man behind the counter, who seemed to be watching me out of the corner of his eye. I set the sandwich down and reached for my coffee, trying to focus on something else. But as I lifted the cup to my lips, I noticed something. The plate under my sandwich, its rim was decorated with the same kind of markings I'd seen on the walls. My stomach tightened. I pushed the plate aside and leaned back in the booth, my eyes scanning the diner more closely. The carvings were everywhere, on the table legs, on the door frame leading to the kitchen, even faintly etched into the floor tiles. I had seen symbols like these before, in a book about cemeteries and burial rituals. They were the kinds of markings used to denote grave sites or, more disturbingly, to ward off spirits. My heart began to race as the realization sank in. This wasn't just an old diner with a strange aesthetic. These symbols meant something, and whatever it was, I didn't want to find out. I glanced toward the counter. The man was still there, wiping down the same section of the counter over and over, his back to me. I decided it was time to leave. I reached into my bag, pulled out a few bills, and placed them on the table. The man didn't turn around as I stood and grabbed my coat. My pulse was pounding, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but I forced myself to walk calmly toward the door. The bell jingled as I stepped outside, and the cold night air hit me like a slap. I practically ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as I unlocked the door. Once inside, I started the engine and sped out of the parking lot without looking back. The rain had stopped, but the road was still slick, and my tires splashed through shallow puddles as I drove. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept returning to the diner and those symbols. I'd read about them years ago, in a book about burial rites and rituals. They were ancient, tied to beliefs about death and the afterlife. Some were meant to protect the living from the dead. Others were used to summon things. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as the memory of the markings flashed in my mind. Why were they in that diner? Why were they on the walls, the tables, even the dishes? As I drove, I felt a creeping sense of unease. It wasn't just the memory of the symbols or the strange man behind the counter. It was something else, an overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw nothing but the empty road stretching into the darkness behind me. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was as if something from that diner had followed me, lingering just out of sight. The miles seemed to drag on forever, and I found myself gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was all in my head. But no matter how much I rationalized, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. When I finally saw the lights of a small gas station up ahead, I pulled over without thinking. I needed a moment to breathe, to shake off the fear that had been building since I left the diner. The gas station attendant greeted me with a tired smile as I walked inside. The fluorescent lights were harsh but comforting after the dim, oppressive atmosphere of the diner. "Rough night?" the attendant asked as I paid for a bottle of water. "You have no idea," I muttered, my voice shaky. As I stepped back outside and got into my car, I glanced at the road behind me one last time. The dread was still there, sitting heavy in my chest. I didn't know what I had stumbled upon in that diner, but one thing was certain: I never wanted to go back. It's been years since that night, and I still think about the diner sometimes. Not every day, but often enough that it feels like a splinter lodged in the back of my mind, an irritation I can never quite remove. I never drove that stretch of road again. Not because I was afraid of getting lost, but because I couldn't bear the thought of seeing that neon sign flickering in the darkness, calling me back. For a long time, I tried to forget about it, to convince myself that it was just an old, run-down diner with odd decor and an even odder attendant. But deep down, I know better. Those symbols weren't random, and the feeling I had while sitting in that booth, the cold, creeping certainty that I didn't belong there, wasn't just paranoia. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed longer. What was behind that door in the back of the diner, the one surrounded by the most elaborate carvings? Was the man behind the counter just an employee, or was he something else entirely? I'll never know the answers, and maybe that's for the best. The memory of that night has changed me in ways I can't fully explain. I'm more cautious now, more attuned to the strange and the unusual. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself staring at the walls of my home, half expecting to see those same symbols etched into the plaster. But the worst part is the dreams. They don't come often, but when they do, they're vivid and disorienting. I'm always back in that diner, sitting in the same booth, staring at the same plate. The man behind the counter watches me, and the symbols seem to glow faintly, as if alive. When I wake up, it takes me a few minutes to shake the feeling that I've brought something back with me. I don't talk about that night with anyone. It's not the kind of story people want to hear, and honestly, I don't want to relive it any more than I already do. But every now and then, I wonder if someone else has stopped there. If someone else has sat in that booth, stared at those symbols, and felt the same chilling certainty that they've stumbled into something they shouldn't have. And if they did, I wonder if they got away. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.